So yeah, I want to talk a little bit about a phenomenon that I call reification in mathematical modeling. Oh, what does that sound mean?
Nothing, Mel. Just keep going. It's the chat. Just keep going.
Oh, Jesus Christ. I can't make that stop, can I?
Yes, you can. If you go back to the app and you click on the chat, there is a little cogwheel at the top left, and you just have to remove the notifications. Did you find the cogwheel, Mel?
Yes, in theory.
The one that's on the top left in the chat function?
Oh, there.
It should say
Okay, I think I did it. Okay, cool. Sorry about that. So I want to talk about a phenomenon that I call reification in mathematical modeling. And I want to extend my discussion of that to the case of machine learning, which I consider to be a use case of mathematical modeling. And basically what that is what I've called mistaking the math for the territory. And I want to discuss some of the potential harms that can come from that sort of reification, especially in the domain of machine learning. So I'm going to cover a couple of preliminaries on scientific modeling. I'm going to describe machine learning as a variety of scientific modeling, and I'm going to then characterize what I mean by reification in mathematical modeling, give 3 examples of that, and then discuss briefly how it applies to active inference and the free energy principle. So the basics of scientific modeling. Models are taken to be abstract structures which enable investigation into real-world systems called target systems. And the analogy here is that model is to target as map is to territory in the sort of Korzybskian depiction of the map of the territory, right? Modeling aims to give us predictive, interventional, or explanatory purchase or leverage. It aims to give us grip on some target phenomenon in nature. These being entities, forces, processes, or causal relationships in the world that we're aiming to have predictive or causal or explanatory purchase over, right? Now, on the sort of contemporary mainstream account of scientific modeling, models are taken to be interpreted structure. So what a model consists in is a physical, mathematical, or computational structure plus a scientist's interpretation or construal of that structure, which relates it to a target system. This is perhaps easily seen in the case of model transfer. So there's a famous model called or 2 models called the Lotka-Volterra model, right? This is a system of nonlinear differential equations, and originally these were proposed in physical chemistry by Lotka, and then they got brought into ecology in the study of predator-prey dynamics. So originally, these differential equations were describing concentrations of chemistry, right, of chemicals, and how those were a sort of oscillator, right? And then in the biological sphere, these came to represent the sort of interplay between predator and prey dynamics, population dynamics, right? So it's the same math, but the interpretation is making them different models because they're describing different things in nature. They're being used to model different things in nature. Now, machine learning, right, a computational technique for big data analysis that generates statistical model of the data it's trained on, given the instructions of an algorithm, right? I think this is pretty straightforwardly, usefully considered a type of modeling in the same sense that we are discussing modeling in the phil-sci literature. So this I don't want to take this to be a metaphysical claim right now. I'm not saying that the ontology of ML is that it's the same sort of thing as the models that scientists use in general, anywhere and always. But I think at least pragmatically, it's going to be useful for us to consider ML as a type of modeling in the same sense that we're discussing scientific modeling in general, right? Now, reification I take to be, in the case of mathematical modeling, a mistake, a confusion of an abstract, non-real, or non-referring mathematical element of the model or its results for something that's real, concrete, and in the world. So anywhere that we're doing mathematical modeling and we mistake the map for the territory, as it were, we mistake the element of math, some element of math, some, sign flip, some variable, some constant, what have you, some correlation. And we take it to be something real. We take it to be the target phenomenon of interest, right? That's reification. The first case of this is when and I'm not saying that these are necessarily exhaustive. I'm sure you could, if you thought even a little, you could come up with cases that fall outside of the sort of scope of these. But I thought it would be best to illustrate these with some examples. The first one I consider is when we have a dummy or a nuisance variable, we have a constant or some otherwise bookkeeping device or non-referring term in the mathematical model. And we take that to be a genuine entity or force or process or causal relationship in the world. That is, we take it to be an element that exists in the target system and is of interest to us. Let's say, so we might say that for this, that we have some bit of math in a model that's merely a bookkeeping device, and we say, oh, that's a particle. And then we go out and we go and look for that particle. Well, it's not a real particle. It was just, we needed that W there in order to make everything else check out, right? There's a mathematically contingent reason why that element of the mathematical model is there. And it's not because it's telling us something about some concrete thing out in the world. Another case is when the history of model transfer leads us to erroneously associate a particular interpretation or construal, that is a particular, mapping between the structure, the mathematical structure and the target system, that isn't licensed under the current application of that model, right? So we might say that interpreting entropy in information theory as, thermodynamic entropy is such a case, right? We have this strong physical association with the notion of entropy, so we just take it to mean, physical distribution of states instead of, or physical dispersal of states or something like that, or something about the equilibration, right? When it doesn't mean that. We're using it in strictly statistical or information theoretic sense, right? Another case of this is ergodicity under the free energy principle, right? Under the FEP. There have been 2 papers that came out this past year alone, the Tapalo, Thompson, and Beer, and the Columbia and Palacios, that both really harp on the notion of ergodicity under the FEP, insisting on interpreting these as the physical notion of ergodicity, right? When the FEP is, I've gone to great pains to argue it's not physics. It's not a description at the level of physics, right? To the extent that it can be taken as a description of systems in nature or a model of systems in nature, it's not operating at the level of physics, right? This is not StatMech, right? So that's a reification, right? And it's a reification specifically because, right, the formalism of the FEP is one that some of it originated in physics. It went through ML, and then it went into, modeling in bio and neuro and coxi, right? And then it got, now it's getting brought back into ML, but it's had this sort of long, winding, labyrinthine path of model transfer. And that's led us to be sort of confused about the way we're interpreting the terms under it, right? So it's kind of easily understandable why we would make these mistakes, but nonetheless, it's a mistake, right? Ergodicity under the FEP is not the ergodicity of physics. Reification case number 3, and this is sort of I'm sort of stretching it to be two cases, but I think that they're really fundamentally the same phenomenon, the same mistake, right? And this is a case in which brute force statistical techniques, e.g. ANOVA, analysis of variance, right? Multiple correlation, regression, factor analysis, principal component analysis, right? These are generating us raw correlational data from the data sets that they run on. And then these correlational results are interpreted as, in some sense, causal. They're given a realness and a concreteness that's totally unwarranted, given what data they've been fed, right? And this is first diagnosed by Lewontin and Levins and Lewontin, and this is the original case for the characterization of reification. So there hasn't been a real formal characterization of reification. This is my first stab, and also the literature's first stab at a sort of formal characterization of what we mean by reification in modeling. But Lewontin is using this notion of reification in modeling, at least going back to the 70s. And this is the use case that he's referring to here. So he says, if you'll pardon the quotes, I think that they're powerful, and I think you'll see the analogy to the ML case here pretty readily. The most egregious examples of reification are in the use of multiple correlation and regression and of various forms of factor and principal components analysis by social scientists. Economists, sociologists, and especially psychologists believe that correlations between transformed orthogonal variables are a revelation of the real structure of the world. Biologists are apparently unaware that in constructing correlation analysis itself, they impose a model on the world. Their assumption is that they are approaching the data in a theory-free manner and that data will speak to them through the correlation analysis. If, however, we examine the actual relationship between dynamic systems and correlations, it becomes clear that correlation can create relationships that do not exist. Because the methodology of correlation is intrinsically without theoretical content about the real world, that is thought to be its greatest virtue. Any statements about the real world must come from the content imported into the analysis. Further, of course, every investigator will repeat endlessly that correlation should not be confused with causation. But such a disclaimer is disingenuous. No one would bother to carry out the correlation analysis if they took seriously the caveat that correlations are not causations. After all, what is the use of the analysis except to make inferences about causation? And I think this is particularly the case when we want to intervene on a system. We cannot intervene on correlations if there's no causal relationship there. If we are talking about systems where we want to intervene, for example, medicine or policing or the judicial system, right? These are cases where we want to intervene. So there's no point in running statistical analyses there unless we're, in some sense, latching onto something causal that we're able to effect in that system, right? So I think that this analysis that Levins and Lewontin give is very straightforwardly just the same case of what's going on in the most egregious examples of ML gone awry, right? Automated decision-making systems in socially sensitive positions, making disastrous decisions, right? In the case of, in the United States, the most egregious cases of this, right, have been in predictive policing and in generating risk scores for recidivism rates, right? But you can see this all over the place too, right? You can see this in, in predictions of who gets a loan and in predictions of who gets priority treatment for, hospital, right, for triage, right, for the vaccination distribution, all sorts of cases. We're using ML to govern really important, and by that I mean like life or death situations for people, for real people, right? And what we're doing is we're finding correlational relationships And we're then acting on those as though those are real causal relationships, as though those are really getting at some fundamental feature of the system in nature of interest, and we're acting on it as such. And the results are disastrous because we've actually latched onto something, we've latched onto a statistical relationship that's very far afield from what we think that we're modeling, right? So in predictive policing and in the recidivism predictions, right, what we're looking for is actually, right, we don't say this, we're never going to say this, but what we're looking for, right, is a bad guy metric or a bad neighborhood metric. We're looking for, you know, the real causal factors there that lead certain people to be more bad than others, to be more prone to crime than others, or the occupants of certain neighborhoods to be more prone to crime than others, right? Why? Because we want to send the cops to the neighborhoods that are prone to crime. We want to do parole supervision on the guys who are more prone to crime, or we want to give them, you know, longer sentences, right? Unfortunately, what these methods are latching on to is erroneous correlations. And these are correlations that are actually picking up more on things like the race bias or the class bias already inherent in parole supervision or in sentencing or in policing, right? Rather than who's actually a bad guy or what neighborhood is actually a bad neighborhood, in so much as those notions can even make sense, right? And the problem here is that we end up reifying things like, you know, the bad guy or the bad neighborhood, when what we've actually picked up on is nothing to do with that, right? And the results are disastrous, right? The results are drastically increasing existing inequities in these systems, and they should be of, I think, real urgent moral concern to us, as well as, you know, the case being of an obvious epistemic concern, right? Because we're making a kind of category error in what we're attributing to what, right? In the case of active inference, I was a bit concerned to read the description on the website, because the description of this conference on the website brings up the cases of predicting recidivism rates, right? And it attributes that to the decisions of black box networks. And then the claim seems to be something to the effect of, that's a vulnerability that active inference, the FEP, right, are not vulnerable to, right? Utilized in machine learning, right? One of the main attributes of active inference in machine learning is that it is transparent. The models at play are fully explicit and specify the causal factors that generate data. This is an incredible advantage over black box networks that can lead to the perpetuation of social problems when they draw from, e.g., historical data. So it's not saying that there's not an explicit claim that that use of active inference in ML is not capable of perpetuating social problems. But it's strongly suggested by this, right? It's strongly suggested that when we're doing generative modeling, we're really getting at the causal mechanisms that give rise to the data we observe, right? That the generative process, the causal mechanisms of the generative process are actually being captured by the generative model for certain. And that because that's the case, and because everything's made explicit under generative models, that the perpetuation of social problems shouldn't be a concern under use of active inference in ML. And I think this is really badly mistaken. I think it's possible to take this in a bad direction, and that's of some concern to me. So, for one, this notion of reification, right? This absolutely occurs in the absence of opaque models, right? We don't need model opacity, right, to see reification. When we're talking about, you know, when Lewontin is talking about reification, the initial cases of reification that he observes, right, in these big statistical techniques, The problem is not that we don't know what's going on, that we can't open the black box of the model, right? The problem is that we are bent on reading reality or causality into the results of our statistical modeling, even when that's not licensed, even when that's not there, right? And it's also a concern to me because generative modeling demonstrably does not deliver the true causes of the generative process, right? We'd like that to be the case. That's the ideal case, right? And certainly active inference, any kind of generative modeling has some sort of a priori benefits over other methods for certain particular use cases. However, that doesn't mean that all the other ML techniques are just trying to get at real causality and, you know, for some feature of the formalism is enabling active inference to really latch onto the true causes, right? That's not the case. You know, all machine learning methods, right? Like all statistical techniques more broadly, really are trying to give us analyses that give us the causes of the data we observe, right? That's the goal of all of this. And some methods are better than others at doing that, but we need real care to bring that about. And simply asserting that our method delivers true causes, unlike the other methods, is, I think, dangerous. I think it's dangerous, and I think it's a self-reification. So yeah, I wanted to be a bit. That's it. That's the end of my talk. I wanted to be a bit harsh there. I wanted to give a little bit of a prod there to be careful in the way we address this stuff. So.
Okay, thank you, Mel. Now, if anyone has questions, you can line up at the Q&A podium and you can start asking your questions for Mel. I think Marco is slowly edging towards the, oh, and so is Maxwell. So Maxwell, if you want to start asking your question, go ahead, step into the orange circle.
Hey there.
Howdy, how's it going?
Pretty good. Hope you're doing well. Yeah, I mean, I enjoyed your talk. Thanks very much. So I mean, I think you were also not characterizing necessarily the proponents of active inference as suggesting that there were no ethical, you know, concerns or implications, automatic ones, right? Like I think the kind of minimalistic or modest claim with respect to the ethical benefits of explainability is that at least in theory, you can understand why, or rather you have an increased grip on, you know, why your model arrived at the decision that it did. If you compare it to, for example,
in principle, it's possible. Yeah. So if you've got a proprietary model, right? You've got a proprietary model that's making socially sensitive decisions in the public sphere, or you've got a fully opaque model, a model that isn't explainable, that isn't transparent, that's making socially sensitive decisions, right? Then there is in principle no way that we can really understand what's going on there, right? So of course,
I don't know if I would agree there, in the sense that at least with an explicit generative model, you have an understanding of the knowledge structures that you're bringing to bear. So there is at least the possibility for self-critical appraisal.
If you've got an opaque model, or you've got, for example, a proprietary model, there are a lot of reasons that certain models are in principle unavailable for our analysis of them. And when you have a model, like, you know, when we're doing generative modeling, that's in principle available to our analysis, yeah, that's worlds better, right? Because it's still, you know, it's in principle possible to do the analysis that helps us understand what's really going on there.
Right.
But then the analysis still has to come. It's not enough that it's transparent. We still have to carry out the analysis. And as I was hoping to motivate with this talk, it's totally still possible to fuck up that analysis. In fact, our history of doing these analyses is one of fucking it up, right?
Right. And I think all these questions are absolutely critical and stuff, and I think you're bringing attention to them in a great way. But I just wanted to point out the claim is a lot less like maximalist, right, or whatever. The claim is very minimal and is just meant to say that this is potentially a tool that we can use to help elucidate all of these things in a way that more traditional methods are. But I don't want to take all the question time. Sorry. Thank you for your talk.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Point taken, absolutely. The thing for me is we often wave around, for quite some time now, we've been waving around transparency and fairness as though, we get a statistical fairness metric or we get some sort of out of the can definition of transparency, and we get some certification of our model, like our AI is transparent, our AI is fully explicable, our AI is fair according to this one fairness method, that fairness analytic that we came up with, and that's almost never enough, because it's never context sensitive, right? It's never enough. And I worry that we're starting to go there with causality, right? That we're starting to say, oh, our methods specify causes in some sense. That's that really isn't.
That's a separate point, though. I mean, I do think that the active inference stuff and the fact that like the structure of the formalism is about hypothesis testing at least lends itself to causal investigation, right?
So we're gonna have to try to move on, unfortunately, because I think other people wanted to ask questions, and there's really only 4 minutes left. So I know that Marco skipped his turn, but Alex is still in line. Alex, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Hey Mel, how are you doing?
Good, how are you?
Good to see you in the virtual.
Long time no talk.
Yeah, for real. Well, so I had a kind of philosophical question that does not lend itself to like 2 minutes, but I guess I'm just wondering. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering how, if you think that there's any form of modeling or scientific practice or like cognition that would do better, or that
like
would
cognition.
That
just vastly increased the problem space, didn't it?
Yes, true. I'm not sure. Okay, well, you can decide to take or leave that parameter. But like, do you think there's any form of modeling, let's say, that would count as like delivering the true generative process, or is that just like a transcendent ideal of some kind?
I mean, certainly that's going to come in vast shades, right? I want to say there's a huge gamut of potential variation there. But yeah, I think maybe like the full the model captures all aspects of the cosmos. I mean, actually, I think actually I want to say that's no longer modeling, right? Like in order to be a model, in order to constitute a process of modeling, we need to be abstracting or idealizing or discarding variables, right? Something is not a model of something if it is engendering all the causes that it's a model. It's not a model anymore if it's got all the causes, if it's latched onto all the causes, right?
Cool. I'm really happy with that answer, actually.
Cool. 1 for 1.
Yeah.
1 for 2.
Okay. So we may have time for Stephen's question after all. So Stephen, can you go ahead and ask the question? But after we will move on to Julia's presentation.
Thanks, Mel. Yeah, great talk. I was just wondering, So the machine learning sort of comes out of maths and some of that work, and then you've got science coming to being brought to bear under the free energy principle. So I suppose in post-normal science, they're talking about, you know, how you can't, and complexity, you can't necessarily get causality, so you can only have decision support rather than decision proof. So I'm wondering, like, is there a danger, like, because it's got this scientific underpinning that people, I mean, even if it's not within the active inference community, people can say it's scientific, therefore, and it's also mathematical, therefore, and then the reification starts to be enforced upon it because it makes it a good sales pitch. I don't know if that's something that you're concerned with, or
so like undue importing of epistemic sort of authority because of the science label. Yeah, certainly that's the case. In particular, I think like machine learning methods today abound with physics concepts that actually aren't the physics concepts, but are just formal analogs. And that's one case where we're totally letting the authority of the fundamentality of physics, you know, attempts to bring in sort of undue epistemic authority there. But I think there's more of a benefit there than there is a trade-off. Why? Because I think that if we treat ML as a type of scientific modeling, then we need to hold it to the same standards of scientific models, and I think that's worth more than the potential for that kind of epistemic authority slippage.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mel.